May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our strength and our salvation. Amen. Death by crucifixion was not uncommon in first century Palestine. Many people were put to death by Palestine's Roman occupiers. The Romans employed the public spectacle of crucifixion to intimidate and to compel compliance in their subjects. The Romans particularly deployed crucifixion as the punishment for insurrection against the state, or even perceived intent toward insurrection. Biblical scholar Bart Ehrman argues that those who were perceived to be enemies of Rome were unceremoniously condemned to be crucified precisely in order to show how absolutely helpless anyone is who thinks it's possible to oppose the power of Rome. Ehrman explains that in the act of crucifixion, because your hands and feet are nailed securely to wood, you therefore are left to hang in an extremely vulnerable position where you cannot fend for yourself. You are not able to move your body, to wave off scavenging birds, or to kick away roaming dogs. You are powerless to lift a finger to help yourself. And indeed, it often took a couple of days for a crucified person to die, usually as a result of asphyxiation. And to add insult to injury, the Romans generally didn't allow crucified persons, especially those considered to be enemies of the state, to be given a proper burial. The Romans left these people on crosses for days as their bodies rotted and were attacked by scavengers, before eventually tossing what remained of their flesh into a mass grave. Indeed, crucified persons were left hanging as a public warning about what happens to the bodies of those who think that they can start their own kingdoms. Crucifixion was therefore an extremely effective tool of terror, which the Romans employed not infrequently to maintain their power over their subject peoples. In the years just prior to Jesus' birth, there was a leadership vacuum in Judea following the death of Herod the Great in 4 BC. At that time, the Roman governor of Syria was a man named Varus. In the aftermath of Herod's death, one of Varus's deputies traveled to Jerusalem. And while in Jerusalem, this opportunistic deputy took advantage of the chaos, breaking into and plundering the temple treasury, and then setting fire to several buildings on the Temple Mount. As a result of these actions, a large Jewish militia attacked Varus's deputy and his entourage in an effort to protect the temple from complete destruction. Word of what had transpired made it back to Varus, and in response, Varus moved 2 legions of soldiers from Syria to Jerusalem to take the Jewish militia prisoner. Ultimately, Varus decided to make an example of his prisoners. Records show him having crucified 2,000 Jews, people who had simply been trying to defend the temple from destruction. Memories of Varus's mass crucifixion and others like it would certainly have been alive in people's imaginations during Jesus' lifetime. Crucifixion was an extraordinarily public and painful version of the death penalty, making crucified bodies hard to avoid or ignore. It's not unlikely that Jesus even witnessed or heard about crucifixions during his childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood. So why was Jesus, in particular, ultimately put to death by crucifixion? The Romans chose crucifixion because people had begun referring to Jesus as a king, and his kingship was most certainly not sanctioned by Rome. As such, Jesus was an automatic enemy of the state. Biblical scholar Warren Carter summarizes the situation in this way. Jesus begins his public ministry by announcing that he represents a kingdom that is not Rome's and claims to be doing so with divine sanction. Jesus then gathers followers, teaches a social vision marked by equality and justice, and attracts considerable crowds whenever he teaches or heals. Jesus attacks the power base of the ruling faction in Jerusalem, declares that he will return in power and glory, and intimates that he will hold the nations accountable for how they have treated the poor, the needy, and the vulnerable. Even though Jesus never led an armed rebellion, his ministry made him a threat to Rome and to the members of the Jewish elite who derived their power and status from collaboration and collusion with Rome. Ideological rebellions, it seems, were just as threatening as physical ones. Rome simply wouldn't tolerate the possibility of Jesus inciting a popular protest movement. It was best to nip these kinds of things in the bud, at least from Rome's perspective. Keep the people subdued and hopeless. So Jesus is arrested, subjected to interrogations, flogged, humiliated, and crucified. Jesus' crucifixion, an event so very integral to our faith, was probably more of a non-event for most residents of Jerusalem in the year 33. Crucifixion wasn't rare or remarkable under Roman rule. Moreover, most Jerusalemites probably had only a passing acquaintance with Jesus or his followers, if any awareness of them at all. Jesus and his disciples were country folk. They, like many others from outlying areas, had descended upon Jerusalem for the Passover festival, which means that Jerusalem would have been bursting at the seams. This was one of the busiest times of year in Jerusalem, because all Jews had to come to Jerusalem at Passover to sacrifice a lamb in the temple. On the eve of Passover, all Jews were to bring their lambs to be slaughtered in the temple court. Each lamb's blood was caught by a priest in a gold or silver vessel, which was then passed down a long row of priests to be poured upon the altar. The slaughtered lambs were then taken to people's homes or to their rented Passover accommodations, where they would be roasted and eaten. The requirement to sacrifice a lamb was a way to memorialize the very first Passover, when God told Moses, as recorded in the book of Exodus, "Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. Take care of the lambs until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night, they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you." That night, as a result of God's intervention, Pharaoh decided to release the Israelites from their enslavement in Egypt. Of course, Pharaoh would soon change his mind and pursue the Israelites after growing anxious about losing their labor. But the Israelites were saved by the waters of the Red Sea and kept their freedom. Because Passover was the time of year when the Jewish people recalled their escape from slavery in Egypt, it was also a time when the dissonance of any continuing subjugation became particularly acute. Under Roman rule during Jesus' lifetime, rebellions, armed or otherwise, often took place during the days of Passover, as some Jews sought to reclaim the freedom that was meant to be their birthright. But as far as we know, besides driving the buyers and sellers out of the temple, Jesus undertook no other particularly disruptive actions. Or did he? Perhaps Jesus' healings were even more disruptive than acts of violence or destruction could ever have been. The ability to heal was a gift from God. So if Jesus could heal, perhaps many of the other things he said were true as well. Perhaps he really was, in fact, some sort of king after all. Recall Pilate's questioning of Jesus in John's Gospel. Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom does not belong to this world. If my kingdom belonged to this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king." Later, Pilate entered his headquarters again and asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have the power to release you and power to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above. You can kill me, but you have no power over me." Amen.